December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. The United States enters the war. For Japanese soldiers, the code is clear. Surrender is not an option. Captured men are despised, dishonored, erased. But as the tide of war turns, thousands of Japanese soldiers are taken prisoner. They are sent not to the torture chambers they imagined, but to camps across the United States. There, behind barbed wire, they encounter something that shakes them to the core. 3 meals a day, clean clothing, beds with blankets, and food more abundant than most Japanese civilians would ever see during the war. For men trained to expect death, the shock of survival becomes something even stranger. The enemy they were told was barbaric is feeding them better than their own army ever had. This is the story of Japanese prisoners of war in America. A story of disbelief, cultural collision, and a quiet legacy carried back across the Pacific. The first arrivals come in 1942. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, men step off trains with hollow E. They grow stronger, healthier, even as their homeland starves. In Texas, Arizona, and California, new arrivals are issued clean uniforms. They are shown orderly rows of bunks, neatly stacked supplies, and medical clinics with real medicines. For men who had marched barefoot through mud, these sights are as disorienting as the meals themselves. At Camp Hearn in Texas, prisoners are stunned to find not only food, but small comforts: soap, cigarettes, even access to Red Cross parcels. One man later admitted, "I could not believe such things existed in war." The shock is physical as well as psychological. Most prisoners arrive malnourished, thin from weeks of poor rations and exhaustion. Within months, U.S. Army medical reports note significant weight gain among the captives. In one camp, average prisoners were consuming over 3,000 calories per day, more than what most Japanese civilians at home could dream of. Meat, bread, milk, potatoes, beans, staples of an American diet and luxuries to men raised on rice and dried fish. Some men overeat, falling ill from the sudden abundance. Others try to save portions of bread in their jackets, unable to trust that the next meal will truly come. Slowly, they realize it always does. This abundance sparks confusion, even fear. Why would enemies treat them better than their own commanders had? Why waste food and medicine on prisoners? Rumors spread in the barracks. Some believe the food is poisoned. Others whisper that the Americans are fattening them for labor, or perhaps for execution. But weeks turn into months, and the meals never stop. Letters sent home to Japan, when permitted, leave out these details. Prisoners fear that telling the truth, that they are eating well, will only deepen their family's suffering. Instead, they write vague assurances. "I am alive. I am healthy." But among themselves, the disbelief lingers. The Americans who firebomb their cities and sink their ships are the same people handing them coffee in the morning. It is a contradiction no training had prepared them for. One diary entry captured the feeling, "Back home, my mother waits in hunger. Here the enemy gives me bread. I do not know what to think anymore." The enemy they expected to be cruel is showing order, even restraint. The Americans follow rules, keep schedules, enforce discipline, but rarely brutality. This alone is a revelation. At roll call, guards count the men with efficiency, not malice. When prisoners fall ill, they are sent to infirmaries with bandages and medicine. When wounds from the battlefield reopen, American doctors stitch them closed. These are not the actions of demons. They are the actions of soldiers, following orders to uphold laws of war that Japan itself had scorned. The first weeks of captivity are thus a battle of the mind. Every meal, every medical check, every night in a warm bunk chips away at the image of the barbaric American enemy. Prisoners wrestle with the shame of surrender and the reality of survival. They had been prepared for torture. Instead, they face something almost harder to endure: kindness that defies their beliefs. By the end of 1942, thousands of Japanese POWs across America share the same bewildered conclusion. The war outside the fences is merciless, but inside their captors are giving them food, shelter, and even dignity. The shock of that realization will echo through every aspect of their captivity and long after they return home. For the first time, Japanese prisoners begin to understand. Captivity in America will not be the death sentence they imagined. It will be something far stranger: survival with abundance. The first shock fades into routine. Prisoners wake to the sound of whistles and boots. Roll call begins at dawn, guards counting rows of men who still cannot believe where they are. The barracks are plain but orderly: wooden bunks, thin mattresses, wool blankets. Each man is assigned a space, his name and number written into Army records. Compared to mud, caves, and jungle bivouacs, the camp feels impossibly stable. Breakfast follows: eggs, bread, oatmeal, sometimes even fruit. For men raised on rice and miso, the taste is foreign. Many gag at the smell of butter, suspicious of milk. But hunger wins, and gradually the food becomes routine. After breakfast, work assignments are posted. The Geneva Convention allows labor, and the U.S. military puts prisoners to use. Fields need harvesting, roads need repairs, timber, irrigation, farm hands, all suddenly filled by men who, weeks earlier, had tried to kill their captors. In Arizona, prisoners march to cotton fields, stooping under the sun. In Idaho, they cut sugar beets from the soil. In Wisconsin, they chop wood, haul ice, and maintain the camp itself. For American farmers, short on manpower, the prisoners are an unexpected lifeline. The work is hard, but it carries dignity. Prisoners earn small wages, paid in camp scrip redeemable at canteens. There they buy soap, paper, cigarettes, and even candy. A world away, their families in Japan survive on scraps. Here, the enemy sells them chocolate. The contradiction deepens each day. How can this be war when labor feels like ordinary life? One man wrote in his diary, "I dug potatoes with an American farmer. He gave me water and thanked me. I felt ashamed to be his enemy." Afternoons bring free hours. Some prisoners study English in makeshift classrooms. Others play baseball, a sport already familiar in pre-war Japan. Teams form, rivalries grow, cheers echo behind barbed wire as though the war is on another planet. At Camp Hearn, POWs stage plays. Actors improvise kimonos from blankets, turning the dusty barracks into a kabuki stage. Orchestras form, borrowing instruments from the Red Cross, filling the air with both Mozart and Japanese folk songs. Art flourishes. Wood carvings, sketches, and elaborate murals appear on barrack walls. Some prisoners paint the landscapes of home: mountains, shrines, cherry blossoms. Others sketch the American countryside, their enemy's world captured with careful strokes. But beneath the surface, unease grows. The camps are not free of tension. Fanatical officers scorn any prisoner who laughs with guards or studies English. To them, Bushido is still alive. Death is preferable to dishonor, and captivity is dishonor. Fistfights erupt. Whispers of betrayal spread. In some camps, moderates who admit Japan may lose the war are beaten, even murdered, by their fellow prisoners. The war lives on inside the wire. American officials notice the danger. Some camps separate hardliners from ordinary soldiers to prevent violence. Still, the fear remains. At night, men lie awake wondering if and yet, daily life continues. 3 meals, labor, rest, Letters to families, carefully censored, are written in neat Japanese script. I am alive. I am healthy, the letters say, concealing the strange truth of abundance. Medical care astonishes prisoners. Infirmaries treat wounds with bandages, penicillin, proper sutures. To men accustomed to dying from infection or neglect, this is incomprehensible. They cannot fathom why an enemy would preserve their lives with such care. One soldier admitted, "When an American doctor sewed my wound, I wept. I thought, even if I live, my country will not forgive me. But here, the enemy wished me to live." Time passes strangely in captivity. Seasons shift, leaves turn, snow falls, spring returns. The world outside continues to burn, but inside the camps, life is measured in meals, roll calls, and letters. Some men grow comfortable. They gain weight, learn English phrases, play music. Others sink deeper into shame, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, clinging to silence. Two realities exist side by side: survival and disgrace. For some, the abundance feels like betrayal. For others, it feels like salvation. By late 1943, thousands of Japanese prisoners are scattered across America. From the deserts of New Mexico to the farms of Iowa, they live behind wire yet eat and work as though part of ordinary communities. Farmers wave at them across fields. Children stare curiously through fences. Some guards treat them harshly, but many more treat them with matter-of-fact fairness. The enemy becomes, if not a friend, at least a neighbor. This daily life carves deep impressions. The camps are orderly, predictable, human. They stand in stark contrast to the chaos, hunger, and ruin unfolding in Japan itself. For the prisoners, this contrast becomes impossible to ignore. In captivity, they are healthier than their families at home. It is a fact that gnaws at them in silence. A prisoner wrote, "My wife and children hide in bomb shelters with no food. I sit in a camp eating bread. The shame is unbearable." Such thoughts divide the men. Some cling to anger at America. Others begin to doubt everything they were taught. Daily life in the camps becomes more than survival. It becomes a quiet war of the mind. Day by day, the routine solidifies. Roll call, meals, work, letters, rest. Behind barbed wire, life feels strangely steady. But beneath the surface, something deeper is happening. The steady rhythm of captivity is eroding the myths Japanese soldiers carried across the ocean. The demon enemy has become the orderly guard. The barbarian has become the farmer sharing water in a field. The truth is no longer what Tokyo proclaimed. For Japanese prisoners of war in America, daily life is no longer simply survival. It is transformation, gradual, reluctant, but undeniable. And in the quiet rhythm of the camps, the seeds of doubt begin to grow. Continue with Chapter 3, 5 minutes, Japanese POWs in America. Shock at humane treatment and abundant food. Chapter 3, Bushido versus reality. Behind the neat rows of barracks and orderly schedules, another war is being fought. Not with guns or bombs, but with ideas. For Japanese soldiers, capture is not only defeat, it is dishonor. The Bushido Code, drilled into them since youth, declares that a true warrior dies before surrender. Now they live in captivity, eating bread and butter from their enemies. Each bite is a reminder of shame. Fanatical officers gather men in secret meetings. They whisper that Japan is winning the war, that reports of American abundance are lies, that anyone who learns English or accepts kindness is betraying the emperor. In some camps, these fanatics rule through fear. Men suspected of weakness are beaten. A few are murdered, strangled in their bunks, their deaths disguised as accidents. American officials notice. Reports of violence spread. The War Department begins separating the most militant officers from ordinary soldiers. Moderates are housed apart, given space to breathe without constant threats. Yet even in safer compounds, the conflict lingers. Every act of survival feels like betrayal. Every letter home feels like a confession of failure. One prisoner wrote, "I bowed my head to receive food from the enemy. I felt my ancestors watching in silence." Another admitted, "When I saw American doctors treat our wounds, I asked myself, why did our own commanders abandon us? Why do enemies show mercy when our own leaders did not?" The contradictions sharpen with time. Prisoners gain weight, grow healthier, play baseball, study English, and yet part of them cannot let go of Bushido. They live in two worlds, the shame of capture and the reality of humane treatment. Some try to reconcile it. They tell themselves survival is a form of duty. Others retreat into silence, refusing to eat, refusing to speak. For the Americans, this psychological battle is not invisible. Intelligence officers study the prisoners carefully. They realize that breaking Bushido is as important as breaking Japan's military power. Pamphlets appear in the camps. Classes are offered. Subtle messages remind prisoners that the emperor is only a man and that surrender is not dishonor. At first, most refuse to listen. But doubt creeps in slowly, carried not by words, but by lived experience. Every time a prisoner receives medicine, every time he plays music, every time he is paid for farm work, he faces the same question. Were the Americans truly demons, or had he been deceived all along? The Bushido Code demanded absolute loyalty, absolute sacrifice. But behind the wire, the "it" is the slow erosion of belief. One diary captures the moment. "We thought we were unbreakable. Yet it is not the whip that breaks us. It is bread. It is kindness. These are harder to endure than pain." The inner war continues, invisible but relentless. For many prisoners, captivity becomes not just a test of the body, but a test of the soul. By late 1943, American officials recognize the truth. Inside every camp, Bushido is dying slowly, not with violence, but with doubt. And as the prisoners struggle to reconcile loyalty with reality, a new chapter begins, one that will shape how they see both America and themselves forever. The war outside rages on. But inside the wire, the silent collapse of belief has already begun. Japanese POWs in America. Shock at humane treatment and abundant food. Chapter 4, American Resentment and Debate. While Japanese prisoners adjusted to life behind barbed wire, another battle raged far beyond the camps. In towns and cities across America, questions rose. Why treat the enemy so well? American families rationed sugar, butter, and gasoline. Soldiers at the front lived on powdered eggs and canned meat. Yet in POW camps, the enemy seemed to be eating steadily, even abundantly. Letters poured into Congress. One Iowa mother wrote, "My boy fights on an empty stomach in the Pacific, while his captors enjoy meat on our farms. How is this justice?" The War Department defended its policy firmly. Officials pointed to the Geneva Convention of 1929. America had signed it. Japan had not. But America would follow it regardless. The logic was simple. If America treated Japanese prisoners with dignity, perhaps, just perhaps, Japan would ease its brutality against captured Americans. It was a fragile hope, but one worth pursuing. There was another calculation. Generals believed that stories of humane treatment might encourage Japanese soldiers to surrender. Every man who laid down arms was one less to kill, one less American life lost on some distant beach. It was a weapon of psychology, wielded not with bombs, but with bread. Yet resentment did not fade. Newspapers ran headlines questioning the comfort of enemy captives. Some veterans returning home bristled at the sight of healthy prisoners in nearby fields. At times, angry crowds gathered outside camp fences, hurling insults. But the policy held. Officials insisted that discipline required fairness. To abandon the rules would be to become the very enemy they despised. In the countryside, something else quietly unfolded. Farmers who worked alongside POWs began to see them not as faceless enemies, but as young men, thin, sunburned, often no older than their own sons. A farmer in Texas later recalled, "They sweated in my fields like any man. After a while, you forgot they were Japanese. They were just workers, grateful for water on a hot day." These human encounters blurred the lines. To many civilians, the enemy was no longer a cartoon in propaganda posters. He had a face, a name, a tired smile at the end of the day. Resentment remained, but reality softened it. Neighbors who once demanded harsh punishment found themselves exchanging nods across fields, even waves through barbed wire. Still, the contradiction remained unresolved. America fought a merciless war abroad, dropping bombs and firestorms on cities. At home, it fed the very soldiers of that enemy. To many, it seemed impossible, yet to others, it was proof that America fought not only to win, but to prove its values in the face of hatred. By 1944, this debate had become part of the larger war effort. Was kindness weakness or strength? Was humanity in war a burden or a weapon? The answer would come not in speeches, but in the minds of the prisoners themselves. Because the more they lived within that contradiction, the more their image of America began to shift. One prisoner later admitted, "We hated them as enemies, but they treated us as men." It was harder to fight such an enemy than one who showed only cruelty. And so, even as American citizens grumbled about coddling the enemy, the policy began to achieve its quiet purpose. The prisoners' hatred was no longer certain. Doubt had taken root. By the war's final years, this doubt would grow into something larger, something that neither side had expected. A transformation that reached far beyond the fences. The war was not yet over, but inside the camps, the first threads of reconciliation had already been woven. Japanese POWs in America, shock at humane treatment and abundant food. Chapter 5, Propaganda and Re-Education. By 1944, the U.S. military understood that Japanese POW camps were more than holding pens. They were laboratories of the mind. Every prisoner was a potential message carrier. If these men returned home after the war believing America had treated them with dignity, that belief could weaken Japan's militarist myths. And so, quietly, a new campaign began. Not of weapons or orders, but of words. Prisoners were given access to newspapers printed inside the camps. Articles praised democracy, reported on world events, and hinted at Japan's defeats. At first, most prisoners dismissed them as lies, but when the headlines matched what they saw with their own E-classes followed. English lessons taught by American officers and visiting professors. Lectures on history, on politics, on the rights of citizens. One prisoner later recalled, "I heard that in America, even ordinary men could vote. I thought it was a trick, but our teachers insisted it was true." Religious services added another layer. Chaplains preached forgiveness, prayed for prisoners, offered Bibles in Japanese. Some men scoffed, others listened in silence, astonished that their captors would pray for them. For men who had been told Americans were without honor, the message was unsettling. Cultural exchange was encouraged. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, prisoners produced a Japanese language newspaper called The Outlook. It mixed reports of daily camp life with editorials on democracy and post-war peace. Though carefully monitored, it gave prisoners a voice, and in that voice, ideas began to shift. The most powerful tool was not propaganda, but lived experience. Every paycheck in camp currency, every fair trial for a disciplinary case, every respectful exchange with a guard, these moments did more to reshape minds than any lecture. One soldier wrote, "We expected torture. Instead, they taught us English. It was harder to hate when we were given words to understand them." Still, resistance remained. Hardliners dismissed the programs as tricks. Some men refused to attend classes, declaring loyalty to the emperor until death. But others began to think differently. Not loudly, not openly, but in quiet reflection. If America could treat its enemies this way, perhaps everything they had been told back home was a lie. By late 1944, American intelligence noted the change. Prisoners, once fanatical, were now discussing Japan's possible defeat. Some even spoke of rebuilding Japan after surrender, imagining schools, factories, and a new kind of government. The re-education campaign was working, not by force, but by steady erosion of myths. A former prisoner summed it up years later. "It was not their leaflets or lectures that convinced me. It was the food, the fairness, the strange kindness. That was the propaganda that won." In this way, America's POW camps became something more than prisons. They were classrooms, slow and subtle, preparing men who would one day carry these lessons back to Japan. Not all were changed. Many left with shame, resentment, or silence. But for some, captivity became an awakening. The irony was stark. On battlefields, America and Japan destroyed one another without mercy. But behind barbed wire, seeds of peace were being planted. Seeds that would grow quietly, long after the guns fell silent. Japanese POWs in America. Shock at humane treatment and abundant food. Chapter 6. Japanese and German POWs. Compared Japanese prisoners were not the only captives in America. By the war's end, over 425,000 German POWs lived in camps across the United States. Side by side with roughly 50,000 Japanese, their experiences revealed striking contrasts. The Germans often arrived in large surrenders, captured at El Alamein in Italy or in France after D-Day. For them, surrender carried little stigma. It was survival, not disgrace. They marched into camps singing songs, some even saluting American officers with formal respect. German officers held meetings, organized lectures, staged operas, and demanded discipline. Captivity was an inconvenience, not a personal shame. The Japanese, by contrast, arrived in smaller numbers, often captured when wounded or exhausted. Surrender was never voluntary. It was forced. For them, captivity was not survival. It was dishonor. Where Germans walked with pride, Japanese prisoners bowed their heads in silence. Where Germans argued for privileges, Japanese prisoners feared even to speak. Food reflected the difference. American rations, bread, meat, potatoes, looked familiar to the Germans. They complained mainly about the lack of beer. For Japanese prisoners, the same meals were foreign. Milk, butter, and beef unsettled their stomachs. Some refused at first, surviving on rice when it was available. Others ate too much too quickly, sick from sudden abundance. Work also divided the groups. German prisoners boasted of their efficiency. They built furniture, repaired machinery, and even taught classes in engineering. The Japanese worked silently, stooping in fields, hauling timber, picking crops. Farmers noticed their discipline, their endurance, but also their reluctance to engage. Psychology set them furthest apart. German prisoners expected to return home and resume their lives. Shame was absent. They even formed camp universities, studying philosophy and politics as though captivity were a long seminar. Japanese prisoners carried wounds no bread could heal. Each day in captivity felt like betrayal. They gained weight, learned English, even played baseball. But deep down, the shame of surrender never lifted. American guards noticed. The Germans could be arrogant, sometimes defiant. But the Japanese seemed subdued, caught between relief and disgrace. One officer reported, "The Germans debate and demand. The Japanese sit in silence. Both are well-fed, both are safe, but only one feels humiliated by survival." This difference shaped re-education. Many Germans resisted until the very end, clinging to Nazi ideology. But Japanese prisoners, once doubt took root, were more open to change. Not all, and not quickly. But over time, lived experience broke through propaganda. Mercy proved more powerful than lectures. In this way, the contrast between German and Japanese POWs revealed something larger. The same camps, the same food, the same guards, yet the meaning of captivity was entirely different. For Germans, captivity was tolerable. For Japanese, it was unbearable, yet strangely transformative. One American officer summed it up simply: "The Germans respected us as opponents. The Japanese were shocked we were human." That shock defined every moment of their captivity. And when the war finally ended, it would shape what they carried home. The barbed wire would not last forever. Repatriation ships waited. And for the prisoners, their survival was certain. Their reception, far less so. Japanese POWs in America. Shock at humane treatment and abundant food. Chapter 7, Repatriation and Return to Ruins, August 1945. Japan surrenders. The war is over, but for the prisoners in America, the journey is not yet complete. Now comes repatriation, the long voyage home to a homeland they scarcely recognize. Ships are readied. The USS General Meigs, the Uruguay Maru, and dozens of others carry thousands of Japanese POWs back across the Pacific. The men board in silence, their faces marked by years of captivity. They leave behind the strange abundance of American camps. They leave behind bread, butter, and milk. They return to an uncertain Japan, bombed, broken, and starving. The voyage is heavy with dread. Men crowd the decks, staring at endless water, wondering what awaits them. Some clutch letters never sent. Others write diaries, confessing fears they cannot speak aloud. One man wrote, "I return alive, yet I fear I return in shame. Will my family welcome me or turn their faces away? When the ships dock, the shock is immediate. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, cities are flattened, reduced to rubble and ash. Rail lines twisted, bridges collapsed. Whole neighborhoods gone. Children with hollow e-mothers line up for scraps of rice. Families live in shacks cobbled together from burnt timbers. The returning prisoners are stunned. They look healthier than the civilians greeting them. They have gained weight, their faces fuller, their clothes intact. Some civilians stare with suspicion, even resentment. You were captured, and you ate this well? For a nation that had endured hunger and firestorms, it feels like betrayal. Many ex-prisoners try to hide their condition. They loosen belts, slump shoulders, avoid speaking of food. But the truth is written on their bodies. Captivity had kept them alive, even nourished them. One man recalled, "My children were thin as twigs. I returned with meat on my bones." They're for some. Reunions are heartbreaking. Families embrace them with relief, but neighbors whisper. Marriage prospects collapse once the word POW is spoken. Employers hesitate, unsure if such men can be trusted. The stigma is heavy. To be a prisoner is to be tainted. Survival carries its own kind of disgrace. Yet gratitude flickers beneath the shame. Men remember American doctors who treated their wounds, farmers who shared water in the fields, guards who enforced discipline, but not cruelty. They cannot speak of it openly, but inside they know. Their survival owes as much to enemy mercy as to their own endurance. Repatriation is thus a double shock. The shock of seeing a homeland in ruins, and the shock of realizing they had lived more comfortably in enemy captivity than their families had in their own nation. It is a truth too heavy to voice, too painful to admit. So most choose silence. But silence does not erase memory. The taste of bread, the weight of blankets, the sound of American voices. These details linger long after the ships dock. And for many, the deepest wound is not hunger, nor shame, nor suspicion. It is the knowledge that captivity in America had given them life, while freedom in Japan had given only ruin. By the late 1940s, tens of thousands of ex-POWs try to rebuild their lives. Some bury the past completely. Others whisper fragments to their children. But in every case, the memory of repatriation, the moment of return to a broken homeland, remains carved into their souls. Japanese POWs in America. Shock at humane treatment and abundant food. Chapter 8, The Long Silence. After repatriation, most Japanese POWs faced a second prison. Not of fences and guard towers, but of silence. In villages across Japan, surrender was still seen as unforgivable. To be captured was to dishonor one's family and ancestors. Even as Japan rebuilt, that stigma remained. Many ex-POWs told neighbors they had been stationed in China, or working in Manchuria, or guarding warehouses in Korea. Few admitted, "I was a prisoner in America." The silence had many reasons. Some feared rejection. Some feared losing jobs or marriage prospects. Others simply could not reconcile the contradiction of their memories. Abundance in captivity, starvation at home. One man later confessed, "Better my children believe I worked abroad than know the shame of my capture." The silence was also cultural. Bushido still cast a long shadow. To speak of good treatment was to confess disloyalty. To admit survival was to admit disgrace. Even when they met fellow veterans, ex-POWs rarely spoke. In gatherings, they listened quietly while others told stories of combat. Their own experiences stayed locked inside. Some wrote diaries but hid them. Others burned letters, unwilling to leave evidence for their families to discover. The silence was a burden carried for decades. A historian later noted, "No one silenced the ex-POWs more effectively than themselves. Shame did what censors could not. But silence did not erase memory. Men remembered the first taste of American bread, the shock of butter on the tongue, the sight of guards praying in chapels. They remembered orchards, baseball games, and pay slips from camp canteens. These details lived quietly in their minds, even when their voices refused to speak them aloud. It was not until the 1970s, when Japan's economic boom had softened old wounds, that some ex-POWs finally began to talk. Elderly men published memoirs admitting for the first time that captivity had been humane, even life-saving. One wrote simply, "I stayed silent for 30 years. Now at the end of my life, I cannot die with the truth hidden." Japanese television produced documentaries showing surviving POWs visiting old camps in America. Audiences were shocked. For many families, it was the first time they learned that their father or grandfather had ever been captured. Children wept, not in shame, but in relief. At last, the silence had broken. Yet even today, the silence remains heavy. School textbooks barely mention the POW experience. Public memory focuses on air raids, atomic bombs and civilian suffering, not on the strange abundance given to soldiers in American captivity. The story lingers in fragments, diaries, faded letters, whispered confessions. It is remembered not by monuments, but by memory itself. Now, for those who lived it, silence was both shield and prison. It protected them from stigma, but it also buried a truth that might have changed how Japan saw its former enemy. The silence lasted decades, but it could not last forever. Eventually, time forced memory to the surface, and when the words were finally spoken, they revealed one of the strangest truths of the war, that captivity in America had been not a curse, but in some ways, a salvation. A truth too heavy to share in youth, spoken only in old age as silence finally gave way. Japanese POWs in America. Shock at humane treatment and abundant food. Chapter 9. Reunions across oceans. By the 1970s, Japan had rebuilt. Factories thrived, cities glittered with neon, and the shame of defeat slowly gave way to prosperity. For some ex-POWs, the weight of silence began to ease. Elderly men who had kept their captivity hidden now sought to revisit the places where they had lived as prisoners. Letters were sent across the Pacific. American farmers received unexpected notes from men they had last seen behind barbed wire. One Iowa family opened a letter written in careful English. "I worked in your fields during the war. You gave me water. I have never forgotten. May I visit you once again?" Such requests startled Americans. For them, the POWs had been neighbors for a season, then gone. Now, decades later, the same men wished to return, not in shame, but in gratitude. Reunions followed. Japanese veterans arrived at small-town train stations, stepping into arms once raised against them. Farmers shook hands with men who had harvested their crops in wartime. Tears flowed freely, language barriers bridged by memory. One farmer's daughter recalled, "My father had spoken kindly of the Japanese prisoners. When one of them came back after 30 years, it felt like family returning. Former prisoners walked through old campgrounds, now empty fields or quiet museums. They traced the outlines of vanished barracks, touched rusted remnants of fences, and stood silently where they had once lined up for roll call. Some carried gifts, wooden carvings made in camp, sketches saved for decades, photographs once forbidden to take. They offered them to American hosts, symbols of gratitude long delayed. Newspapers covered these visits. Headlines told of enemies turned friends, of forgiveness found in unexpected places. For audiences in both nations, the stories were astonishing. In Japan, the public learned for the first time that captivity in America had been not only survivable, but in some cases, humane. In America, readers discovered that former enemies carried memories of kindness across oceans and decades. One reunion ended with words simple but profound. "You treated me as a man when my own country saw me as a disgrace. I came back to say thank you." For the ex-POWs, such visits were more than nostalgia. They were acts of reconciliation, proof that the humanity they had once received was real, not an illusion of war. Not all returned. Many could not bear to speak of captivity, even in old age. But those who did carry their stories back to Japan, telling families and neighbors that America had been different from the enemy they had been taught to imagine. Slowly, through reunions and memoirs, silence cracked open. The truth of POW life in America entered history not through governments, but through handshakes and shared tears. By the 1980s, the once unthinkable had become possible. Japanese veterans and American guards, once enemies, stood side by side at ceremonies, offering prayers for peace. The barbed wire was long gone, but memory remained. Memory now softened by forgiveness and by friendship reborn across oceans. For many, these reunions closed a circle that had remained open for decades. The shame of capture gave way, finally, to gratitude for survival. And the farmers, the guards, the former prisoners all came to the same quiet conclusion. What had once been a story of enemies had become a story of humanity. The war had ended in 1945. But in these reunions, in these embraces across continents, the peace was at last completed. A peace built not only by treaties and governments, but by the memories of men who had once lived as enemies and learned they were human after all. Japanese POWs in America, shock at humane treatment and abundant food. Chapter 10, Legacy and the U.S.-Japan Alliance. The war ended with devastation, but what followed was transformation. Japan rebuilt under American occupation, guided by new laws, new freedoms, and a new role in the world. Amid this rebirth, the memories of former POWs quietly influenced the relationship between the two nations. They had lived inside America. They had seen its abundance, its democracy, its contradictions. Most stayed silent in public, but in families, classrooms, and workplaces, they carried what they had witnessed. They told their children that Americans were not monsters. They spoke of bread, of milk, of fair treatment. One ex-prisoner later recalled, "When I saw how they lived, I understood why we could not defeat them. It was not only their weapons, but their way of life." As Japan entered the 1950s, it aligned with its former enemy. The U.S.-Japan Security Treaty bound the two nations together in defense. What had been hatred became alliance. What had been propaganda became partnership. And in the background of this transformation, the experiences of POWs offered proof that coexistence was possible. If enemies in war could treat each other with dignity, allies in peace could build something American officials recognized this too. They pointed to POW treatment as evidence that America had fought not only to win, but to uphold values. It became part of the story America told about itself, a story of law, humanity, and restraint. And for Japan, these memories softened the sharp edges of defeat. They showed that the new order was not built entirely on humiliation, but also on unexpected respect. This quiet influence mattered. When Japanese leaders debated whether to embrace democracy, whether to accept American partnership, the testimony of ex-POWs carried weight. Men who had lived in the enemy's camps said simply, America could be trusted. It was not an official policy. It was not a government decree. It was lived experience, whispered across dinner tables, carried into classrooms, and folded into Japan's recovery. In time, the alliance grew into one of the strongest in the world. The bitterness of war gave way to shared defense, shared industry, shared culture. The path was not smooth and memory was not simple. But the POW experience stood as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, humanity had been possible. One prisoner summed it up decades later. The Americans defeated us with bombs, but they conquered us with bread. Those words, born of hunger and survival, echoed a truth larger than one man's memory. They captured the paradox of the war's aftermath. Defeat that became alliance, enmity that became trust. The legacy of Japanese POWs in America was not loud. It was not written in treaties or shouted in parades. It lived quietly, in memories and in choices, shaping how two nations saw each other. And though the camps themselves faded into farmland and empty fields, the legacy endured, carried in silence and in gratitude. By the 1960s and 70s, as Japan's economy soared and America faced new wars, the alliance forged in those years grew stronger. Behind it, hidden but real, was the testimony of men who had once been enemies, fed by the hands of their captors. It was proof that war could end not only in bitterness, but in reconciliation. And in this reconciliation lay the foundation of a partnership that still defines the Pacific world today. The barbed wire had long since rusted away, but the memory of bread and mercy remained. A quiet bridge between past enemies and a reminder that even in total war, humanity can survive. Now continue with conclusion, chapter Japanese POWs in America. Shock at humane treatment and abundant food conclusion, humanity in the midst of war. The story of Japanese prisoners of war in America is a story of contradictions. It begins in fire and hatred and ends in bread and silence. For men raised to believe surrender was worse than death, captivity was supposed to mean humiliation and torment. Instead, they found steady meals, clean barracks, medical care, and even kindness. The shock of abundance was it forced them to question the beliefs drilled into them since childhood. And yet that same abundance brought shame. How could they eat bread while their families starved? How could they grow healthy while their nation burned? Every meal was both mercy and burden. The camps were not paradise. They were prisons, watched by guards, surrounded by wire. Violence and fear lingered. Bushido haunted the barracks, and silence often weighed heavier than chains. But within those fences, something unexpected grew. Moments of humanity that survived even in total war. Farmers remembered prisoners as quiet, hard-working men. Children remembered faces at fences, waving shyly. Guards remembered order, discipline, and respect. And the prisoners remembered too, not just the shame, but the shock of survival. Not just the captivity, but the humanity of enemies who offered them food and dignity. When the war ended, they returned to a homeland in ruins. They carried silence, stigma, and hidden memories. For decades, they said little, too ashamed to admit survival, too burdened to confess gratitude. But in old age, the silence cracked. Memoirs were written, reunions held, hands shaken across oceans. The truth emerged, not in bitterness, but in reflection. One ex-prisoner wrote, "I hated them when I fought. I hated them when I surrendered. But in their camps, I learned they were men, not monsters. That was harder to accept than defeat." Another recalled, "America defeated us with bombs, but it conquered us with bread." The legacy of these camps is not only about survival, it is about the quiet role they played in shaping the future. When Japan became America's ally, the testimony of ex-POWs whispered beneath the surface. America could be trusted. It was not policy that convinced them. It was not propaganda. It was the lived memory of food, fairness, and dignity in the midst of war. Today, the camps are gone. The fences rusted, the barracks dismantled, the fields tilled for crops. But the memory remains in letters, diaries, and in the silence of men who carried it all their lives. It is a memory that complicates the simple story of war. It reminds us that even amid destruction, humanity can survive. The Japanese POWs expected only cruelty. Instead, they encountered an enemy who followed rules, who gave bread instead of starvation, who treated wounds instead of inflicting them. That shock did not erase the horrors of war, but it did plant seeds. Seeds of doubt, seeds of reconciliation, seeds of peace. In the end, not the guard tower, but the rule of law, not cruelty, but humanity. It was these things, more than bombs or battles, that endured after the war. And so the story closes where it began, with disbelief. Disbelief that enemies could show kindness. Disbelief that survival could come through surrender. Disbelief that humanity could shine even through barbed wire. Yet it did. And in that truth lies the lasting lesson of Japanese POWs in America. That mercy can sometimes achieve what violence never will. that dignity given to an enemy is never wasted, and that even in the darkest moments of war, humanity remains possible. The barbed wire is gone, but the lesson remains. A quiet testament, carried across oceans and generations, to humanity in the midst of war.